Good morning. Is everybody thoroughly caffeinated this morning? No. There was a lot of despair in the undercurrent of voices there. No, I've not gotten the caffeine into my system yet. I'm really curious. Are any of you like non-caffeine drinkers? Y'all are wild to me. It's like a feral species that exists only on the edges of the maps.
He drinks very much coffee gives him migraines, but he can drink green tea till the cows come home and
caffeine.
And I'll get headaches by drinking too much. And coffee actually makes me calm. It doesn't help me focus. It doesn't. Yeah,
so that's an interesting one.
Water wakes me up as much as coffee does.
I had a youth group kid a number of years ago who had been diagnosed ADHD.
Yeah.
And this was not an overdiagnosis. This kid was definitely ADHD. And his family was wanting to avoid heavy medication, so they put him on the smallest dose of anything they could. And then he just carried a Mountain Dew with him everywhere.
That works.
The caffeine.
Yeah.
And it's absurd dosage of caffeine in a Mountain Dew. And because of how his brain processed all of that stuff, it worked with the meds to dial him back. I was like, oh, I'm just over-caffeinated. That's why I'm so mellow. No, that's not it. I just don't have that extra gear that he seemed to have, that he lived in. Man, traveling with that kid was...
It took forever for me to get her to let Maddie drink Mountain Dew.
I bought the kid for our gag gift Christmas for youth group. I had pulled his name. And I bought him one of those yellow hard hats with the can holders on either side. And we dropped Mountain Dews in that thing, and he'd sit in the class wearing that hat with a tube of Mountain Dew running to his mouth. This is great. He's paying attention, and his mouth is shut. Decision ever. Much better parent to other people's children. Do what? I do not know. What's your favorite drink, Bob?
What's my favorite one?
What's your favorite drink?
My favorite drink.
Monster.
Oh, come on. You can't do that when I have a mouthful of coffee. Oh, that hurt.
Right now it's water.
Water, okay. Then I don't know. I don't know if it works that way. Yeah, Jenny.
Doctor, I went to the doctor last week and I said, do you think I should quit caffeine? He said, what for? He says, yeah, some enjoyment in life.
I quit my Ritalin.
The first cup of coffee gets me going in the morning. The rest keeps me from doing any damage to other people.
Coffee's better.
All right. Glad you're here this morning. We will go ahead and get started with a prayer, and then we will pick up where we left off with class last week, because I was winding down quickly and still ran over time, and it just got to tie up some loose ends to finish off. So let's start with a prayer. God, we thank you for today, for the blessing that it is to be together in your name. I pray that as we spend time together this morning, that we would do so as your family, encouraging each other, building each other up, hoping with each other for the goodness that you have promised in this world and seeking it out. As we study more about you, about your word, I pray that you would give us eyes to see what you would have us to see in Scripture and allow it to shape our lives. It's our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So, I ended last week doing a very rapid rundown of the entire book of 1 Corinthians. Do you remember that, or do I need to do it all over again? It was as quickly as I could spit it out, and I know that it was a little bit disjointed. So we're going to kind of revisit it a little bit because it plays into where we are headed with class this week. And I want to remind you, just in general, because the reason we were talking about 1 Corinthians is because we were looking at how to read New Testament letters. They are their own genre of writing. We've talked about this before. You need to know what you're reading in order to understand what it is. An obituary is not an advertisement. The same thing is true like with 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, you're dealing with letters. The book of Hebrews, you're really looking at a sermon. Those are different writings. They read different ways. Paul tends to write a little bit more directly. Hebrews is loaded with overstatement and imagery that you're not going to see in a letter dealing with a practical problem. To that point, 1 Corinthians, along with all of Paul's other letters, fit a very tight description of why they are written. They're occasional, which means they are written for a specific occasion. Something caused the letter to be written. So in 1 Corinthians, in the first chapter, Paul says, hey, so some people from Chloe's family let me know there were some issues I need to address. So straight off the bat, you know why 1 Corinthians, that letter that we call 1 Corinthians, is written. There was a specific problem. Paul is writing to address it. They are purposeful, which means there is a specific purpose to the letter. These are not generic advice columns. It's a terrible comparison, but it's a little bit like Dear Abby. Somebody has written to Paul with a problem, and Paul is responding directly to that problem. And he's using a lot of wisdom. He's using Old Testament guidance. He's using the Spirit in him to address it, but it is a specific purpose that he's writing to. And then the other part of it is that they are conversational, right? This is a two-sided conversation, and we get part of one side. And the reason I say we get part of one side is because Paul writes, but then he also, in many cases with these letters, plans to, and says, in several instances throughout his letters, I will talk to you more about this when I get there. Which means the conversation is not done. Now, y'all have had this experience, right? You're having a conversation, email, text, we'll use written forms of communication. And no matter how hard you try, you cannot get your point across clearly in that form. Anybody had that experience? The other thing that written communication does, while it allows us to save up and keep, is that it does not do a great job of communicating emotion. It provides no context clues. For those of you who are like face readers who need that to understand, to interpret why, because there's a very difference between saying, I love you with the love of the Lord, and I love you with the love of the Lord. Right? One of those is authentic and the other one is exasperating. And it's me saying something to not say something else. Those are two different statements. Same words, completely different things. My children seem to need this change in tone in order to get the point. Kids, it's time to clean up your rooms. Does not seem to get the point across. Hunter, with his face cupped in my hand about 3 inches away. It's time to clean up your room. Okay, Dad. He tends to get that. What we get from Paul, these written words lack some of that interpersonal communication that they are going to get whenever Paul shows up to help them work through stuff in person. And we're missing that part of the conversation. Occasionally, we get bits and pieces of it down the road, like in 2 Corinthians. Paul will mention something. When I talked to you about this previously, that's not anywhere in the first letter to the Corinthians that we have. So we know there's more to the conversation than we've gotten. So they're occasional, they are purposeful, and they are conversational. What that means for us, when you sit down to read, and I believe this is true for basically every book of the Bible, but I think this is especially true for Pauline letters and for the New Testament writings in general. When you sit down to read them, please take the time to read the whole letter beginning to end. I get that that's way easier with like Philemon than it is Romans, right? I understand. But to me, step one for fully grasping or better grasping what Paul is writing is to take the whole of it in. Because our tendency has been to isolate it out, right? We're going to take a look at these 3 verses right here and study them into oblivion. And we might do an okay job of like, oh, and Paul uses this word here, and he also uses this word here. But that doesn't always do a good job of giving you, that rarely does a good job of giving you a full picture of what's actually being said. Yes?
It didn't, when they received the letter, didn't they hear the whole thing?
Yes. So the way that these letters got passed, Paul would put them in the hands of trusted messengers, people who, there was no like putting a stamp on it and dropping it in the postal system and hoping that it gets there. Like there was a mail service of some sort, but you didn't really use that if it was vital. So Paul would put it in the hands of someone. So like we got a pretty good idea that the letter to the Romans is carried by Phoebe. This is a trusted sister. You need to listen to her. She's carrying this message along. And it was the carrier who had been in contact with the person who wrote the letter, who knew what was going on behind and had been receiving instructions from, that would then take that letter, courier it down to where it needed to go, and then read it in the presence of all of those who were there to hear it. These were like a much lower level of what's the word? Obviously, it's escaping me at this particular moment. They didn't read and write so good. The literacy rate, there we go, in the ancient world was not what it is in our world. So you couldn't just send a letter and expect that somebody there would get it. And even if you did, does somebody disconnected from the writing of the letter have as good an understanding of what Paul's purpose is as somebody who was there with and has had it explained to them? Because the other part of this practice then was you'd read the letter, and then people would ask questions. You need somebody there who can answer the question, somebody who had, maybe spent some time with the author and had some understanding of that, and they would hear it all in one chunk. You do this too. How many of you, okay, so I understand that a long time ago, people used to send like these things called letters to the mail. Did this exist? No, actually, I have some letters even still in my possession that are important. Like, I understand how this works. A long, long time ago. All right, so when you got that letter, you got a letter in the mail from a friend that you've been waiting to hear from for some time, or you did a pen pal thing at school, right? You send letters back and forth. You get that letter. Did you get the letter and open it up, and then flip over to the middle of the letter and read half of a paragraph in the middle of it and hope to find everything that they wanted to communicate to you in that paragraph? Why don't we read New Testament letters the same way? That way. Sit down with the whole thing, because it will help you understand the purpose, the intent, the occasion of the letter way better. The other thing that I think it's important to remember, and what this helps square away, is that what we're reading cannot mean something that it did not mean to its original readers. Meaning doesn't change over time. Right? Paul had a purpose and an intent. That means now how we apply it changes situationally. That's certainly true. But the meaning itself doesn't change, which is why if you read the book of Revelation and you're looking for the end of the world in our time period and trying to figure out which of these is Russia and which of these is China, because goodness, that's the last 60 years of reading Revelation has just been one massive train wreck, courtesy of Tim LaHaye and his friends. Anyway, that's a different conversation. It doesn't mean that. It can't have meant that. Because that would have meant Jack Diddley to the original readers, and you can bet your boots, as apocalyptic as the images in Revelation are, that the original readers understood it. It was sent to them for a purpose. There's a message, and it's to be understood. Some of those images that fly way over our heads made perfect sense to them. And in fact, if you go outside the Bible, there's loads of Jewish apocalyptic literature that reads the exact same way. I show you the War Scrolls. And if you go back to Ezekiel, it's got a little bit of that. The second half of Daniel has it. It's a whole genre of literature that they understood that right over our heads because it's 2,000 years ago. Some of those symbols and images change, right? So if you were to go back to, let's just go back short term in the scale of history. If you were to go back to the 1800s, in the grand scheme of history, that's not that long ago, right? And show them your phone. Okay. I would argue this. At least in the 70s, there were computer minds that were starting to think about the possibilities. Because you would get these futuristic illustrations that contained like computers in them that didn't take up the entire room. In the 70s, a computer took up a room. So they could at least imagine some. But there was a time before that when it was so far off the table. So, 200 years, how does one from the 1800s read, 2020s culture? How does somebody from the 2020s read 1800s culture? We have bits and pieces of history, but we don't have a full grasp of it. We didn't experience it. We didn't live there. Now go back 2,000 years. And even harder for us because we don't have the Jewish tradition baked into every aspect of our lives like the people who lived in Judea did. It was everything and everywhere. It was just constant. There are references and understandings that were just cultural to where they lived and who they lived under that all made sense, escapes us. So it can't mean something that it didn't mean, and that's difficult for us to grasp in every situation because times change, things change. Methods and ways of communication, meanings of work, all of those things. Because they shift, we're left trying to figure it out. And I think we need to be more honest about how difficult that is. We have to be. For a very long time, here's how Bible reading was handed to me. And maybe you got the same thing. And I'm sorry if I'm about to debunk something that's important to you. Just read it and you'll understand it. That was it. That's what I was given. How many of you? That was pretty much what. It's so simple, even a caveman could get this. Okay. No. It's not. And here's the worst part. When you do understand it, it gets harder. There's a lot to be gained from not understanding it. It's way easier if you don't. Because then it doesn't challenge you to do anything. So, again, I think we have to be honest about all of that and give a lot more grace in differences of opinions, of interpretations of what the Bible says along the way and why it says it. And here's the other thing we talked about last week that's important to keep in mind. We all, every single one of us, when we read the Bible, make choices about what we think is still applicable and what we think was simply cultural. And the Bible provides us no good way to distinguish. Which is why there are currently churches in this town that still practice foot washing on a regular basis. If you want a good foot scrub, go visit one Sunday. It's part of the practice. Or Saturday, thank you. I was thinking primitive Baptist, but you're going a different direction. Hey, they're still there, yeah.
I walked into a church in this town, and I didn't have a head covering.
Yep.
Boy, did I feel weird. Plus, I'm going to hell then.
Yes. And that's it. Now, we've decided those things are cultural, right? The Bible doesn't draw those lines for us. Those are decisions that we've made as a people over time. There's also a history of disagreement in our churches about how to do that. Here's another one. In the Bible Belt, amongst churches of Christ, of course, a lot more churches, so it's a whole lot easier to see how everybody kind of feathers out. It's a little bit harder. So there are as many churches of Christ in Spokane Valley area as there were in Altus, Oklahoma. I had that realization the other day. Altus, Oklahoma has 20,000 people in it, just in case you need a benchmark. And that doesn't count all of the little country churches that are within 15 miles of Altus in every direction. Now, one of the things that got talked about when I was a kid, whether or not it was okay for churches of Christ to go in together to support programs, children's homes, missionaries, because, that's a little too denominational. And there's still at least one church here in town where that's a line. They don't do it. You don't support children's homes. It's too cooperational. An argument can be made that you should absolutely do that because Paul rode around taking up a collection for the church in Jerusalem, right? This is something we do together. That was one of those places where they drew a line. No, that was cultural. Simply what they needed at the time in their setting. But we no longer do that. Does that strike you as a weird place to draw a line? Okay? But there it is, and it happens. So we're making these decisions constantly. And there is no good line. There's no writing from Paul in the letter of 3 Corinthians that says, here's a list of things that are cultural, and here's a list of things that last for all time. And what's really funny is if Paul had drawn that list, we'd be arguing with Paul even more than we already do. No, Paul's list of applied for all time includes kissing each other at the door, and we'd have killed that one in the pandemic if we didn't kill it before. So we make those decisions about what's cultural and what isn't, and I think it's important that we're honest with the fact that we do that. And give some grace to others who draw some lines in some different places. There's a difference between the gospel and our understanding of it, and I think recognizing the distance between God and human understanding is an important thing to realize. There's a gap there, and we're all doing our best, but we need to be honest about that. All right, so we're going to talk about places in the Bible where the rules don't play nice with each other. Are y'all ready for some fun this morning? All right, so the first thing I need somebody to turn to Galatians chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. Fair warning, you're going to use the word circumcision. I used to have to really give that warning in teenage classes, because they'd giggle every time, and then somebody in heaven would go, I don't know what that is. Oh, great. And I need somebody else to turn to 1 Corinthians 7:18. These are rules that we're about to read, straight from Paul, and then we're going to read about how they don't work. So, who's got Galatians 5, 2, and 3? Go for it, Bruce.
Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law.
Okay, and I asked somebody to get 1 Corinthians 7:18. Got it, John? Go for it.
Was a man already circumcised and was called, he should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called, he should not be circumcised.
Okay. Just real quick, because I got some laughter, I want to make this clear. In the first century, it was commonplace for Hellenistic Jews to try and have a surgery to undo their circumcision so they could fit in public gymnasiums where, working out was done naked. Reverse the surgery. It was a normal attempt in the first century amongst Jewish people who were trying to fit in to do that. I don't want to try and describe how poorly first century surgeries typically went, but let's just go with bad idea and yet normal occurrence. So that's not Paul making a joke. That's an honest recognition of stuff that happens. All right, so 1 Corinthians and Galatians. Somebody tell me how Paul feels about Gentiles being circumcised. He's against it. All right, that's a good start. Give me more.
According to Galatians, I think he said that if you get circumcised, you have to obey the whole law, and you've basically lost your salvation. Unless
you're really good at law keeping. Now, we got to be honest here. Paul's good with overstatement. This is a thing that exists in our world. We need to remember that this is a thing that existed in their world too. But, Paul ties it to law keeping. Once you do this, okay, you've chosen your path, law keeping. So, obvious. Paul is not a fan of Gentiles pursuing circumcision, certainly doesn't think it's a requirement, and especially in those two passages we just read, is adamantly against it. Do not do it. 1 Corinthians gives us the nice simple line. If you were circumcised, don't undo it. If you weren't circumcised, don't do it. Galatians gives us a little bit more vivid challenge. That's it. Now, jump in.
I think a part of that is it's if you're being circumcised to be saved.
Okay.
Because that's really the gist of that if you read it in the context.
Yes.
Versus later on, which you're probably going to just
we'll get there.
Yeah.
Yep. But Paul states clearly, not only is it not required and not expected, but it's really not a good thing. And we'll go ahead and add the fact that, again, we're talking about first century surgeries where you're rolling the dice on infectious diseases and long-lasting damage. Like, there are very good reasons to not do it outside of the religious sphere in the first century. So, now, Acts 16. Paul went first to visit Derbe and then to Lystra. And if you don't know your New Testament geography, those are cities in the region of Galatia. Letter to the same area. His mother was a Jewish believer. Where a young disciple named Timothy. His mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was a Greek. Timothy was well thought of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium. So Paul wanted him to join them on his journey. In deference to the Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised before they left, for everyone knew that his father was a Greek. Who arranged for it? Who wrote Galatians and 1 Corinthians? I thought we had a rule. And as a preacher, here's Timothy, a well-liked guy, well-respected in the community, Gentile, non-Jew. Isn't that the perfect guy to use as your example? You all respect him. You all like him. He's not circumcised. And you know what? God still loves him. Can we leave it at that? And even better, this occurrence that takes place with Timothy takes place within earshot. I made up a word there, but I like it. Earshot. Of the writing of the letter to the Galatians. It's not like Paul's had 10 years to change his mind on a topic. They're right in step with each other. A year or two. What happened to the rule?
I think Paul prayed and there was a bigger picture.
Okay. A bigger picture.
He had this done at the request of Jesus for a reason that is going to be covered later in his travels.
Yeah. So we'll get to some of the down the road stuff, I think, in a couple weeks. But for right now, this doesn't play nice with the Western world where a rule is a rule, right? Why is Paul making Timothy do something that he told others that they absolutely shouldn't do? And especially in light of 1 Corinthians 7. If you were, great. If you aren't, don't. Never mind the for your salvation part. Paul's giving very practical advice to this church community. There's no need for you to change that. Except for when there's a need for you to change that.
And that could be, when you discuss politicians, you've got to discuss politicians back then.
Okay.
I have a child that doesn't eat kosher.
Yes.
When he comes to my house, even though we eat pork and all kinds of stuff, I would never think of serving it to him.
Okay.
Not that I think it's wrong, but it's courtesy.
Okay.
And not that I think he's wrong either, but if this is what he chooses, so with courtesy and with respect to him, I don't serve.
Right, you're not dishing up pepperoni pizza and pork chops.
No.
Yeah, and this is where, so I'm going to give you a sociologist term. Culturally, the Western world specifically, and especially us here in the United States, we are what is termed a dualistic society. And it has to do with how we were raised and what we expect. We like clean lines, right? I want to know when I have crossed the line. We don't really love gray areas. We want to know what the expectations are, what the requirements are, what the rules are. If a foreign driver from any number of places throughout the world were to show up on our roads and they saw signs and speed limits, pavement, they wouldn't know what to do with it. And there's no conversation or concept in their language and their culture about speed limits or anything like that because you go as fast as you need to. Need being what defines it. They're just general expectations, and it doesn't always work as well as we would like it, but it works well. Watching the Parisian traffic circle, which is like 1 billion lanes, the fact that it's not just one permanent pileup with every vehicle completely immovable and damaged is beyond me, but they understand the rules, and it involves line crossing and moving in and out and making space for each other, and it works. But you put that same traffic circle in the middle of Dallas, Texas, and let me tell you about what every lifted F-250 driver is going to do to the statue that's right in the middle of it. That way. Because it does not work for us. Doesn't make sense. We like black, white, clean and simple. That's not true for every single person, but as a culture, that holds true. The Eastern world is not dualistic at all. Jewish culture in the first century was not dualistic. Things are not clean-cut, black and white. There's loads of room for gray. The rules apply except for when they don't. And one of the important parts of being in that society is understanding when they don't. That doesn't work as well for us because we haven't been taught to think that way. And I could spend more time talking about that, but I've got a lot to cover in the next 8 minutes, so I'm going to just skip on it and say things are different, and it's important for us to recognize that the world does not think the same way we do, does not expect the same things we do, and that's especially true for an Eastern culture 2,000 years ago. And so reading it as if Paul was a 21st century American, y'all, it doesn't work. He wasn't. He's a first century Jewish man. And he carries that language, those expectations, that wording, those ideas and images with him into the text. And we've got to do our best to decipher it, not expect something different from it. All right, so the rules applied until they didn't. And I can go ahead and have no doubt in my mind that if any man in the region of Galatia, after reading this letter from Paul, had said, you know what, I think I still need to go do the whole circumcision thing, Paul had yelled at him for it. Wasn't I clear? The rules applied except for when they didn't. And the reason it applies here, the reason that Timothy goes through this, Paul's reasoning behind it, is in, was the D word, not 4 letters, no profanity, deference. The rules apply except for when they don't. This is where it gets really complicated for us because, one, we don't do deference all that well. We're pretty good at insistence, not deference, again, culturally. And 2, we have to have some honest conversations about how many different directions deference goes. Because if it's a one-way street, it's not deference. And we've got to think about ways in which we can and must defer to each other as we make decisions about what is and isn't acceptable, what does and doesn't happen. Like circumcision, which is not okay, except for when it is, because it needs to happen. Which is exactly what happens in these stories. Now, we'll do one more, because this is not the only way that works. Acts 15, and I'm just going to do references. So if you want to mark these in your brain for later or write them down somewhere. Acts 15, what are the others? Romans 8 and Romans 10. And Revelation 2, those are the places that I'm about to walk all over. In Acts 15, there's this conflict between Jews and Gentiles and how the church is going to function and whether or not there's space in the church for Gentiles at all. Is this just a Jewish movement or is it bigger than that? You got to remember, they didn't do a good job getting along with Hellenized Jews, Jews that grew up outside Judea and had different cultural expectations. So now you're adding Gentiles into the mix, and that gets real interesting. And they finally decide that it's okay, and there's just really a couple of rules that need to be followed for it to work. And one of those rules is that they abstain from eating meat sacrificed to idols. They don't even have to keep full kosher. Just don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. Right? Except for 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul, who was on the receiving end of that instruction from the church in Jerusalem, was there for that agreement. In Acts 15, says, yeah, it doesn't really matter about that whole meat sacrifice to idols thing. Don't eat it in front of people. It's going to be a problem for, but it's not a big deal. That's not what Acts 15 said, and that's not what the agreement said. But here we've got Acts 15 saying, this is the line they can't cross, and Paul saying, dance on the line all you want. Just don't do it in front of somebody it's going to be a problem for. Again, those two moments are not that far apart in space and time. A couple years. So is it a rule or not? Now, it's easy for us to just say, oh, that's cultural. We're not going to have to deal with that because there's no meat to be sacrificed to idols, so we can make an argument about the meat industry. It's not a line for us. But this is a bigger conversation about how the Bible works, and we have to pay attention to how this stuff went down. It's not okay, except for that it's okay. And then, 50 years after Paul, In Revelation 2, in a letter to one of the 7 churches, John writes, "How dare you eat meat sacrificed to idols?" Completely unacceptable. To which Paul's Corinthian audience would say, "What?" But Paul said, "What changed?"
It was written to.
Okay, who it was written to. What else? There's an important key in here, especially for the Revelation passage. Come on. Time. When it was written. Paul's okay with kind of keeping the line in place for those whom it's going to be a problem for. If you know that it's going to be a problem for Cindy Lou Who to come to your house and see a chunk of meat that's got Athena's brand in the middle of it. It's not a thing, but we're just coming up with a way to hide it. You're not sitting there prepping the meal, making sure that brand is prominent on the table because you love your sister. You're doing it to jack it. Which says something about, the heart of the person doing the cooking. But by the time we get to the letter to, who is that to? Nobody looked because I told you not to worry about it because I was going to be running around. But that specific writing was to, and it matters, so I'm looking real quick. Thyatira. By the time John writes instructions to Thyatira, it matters. And there are a number of reasons it matters culturally. The situation has changed in the relationship between the church and Rome, and between local customs in Thyatira versus in Corinth. But it's changed. Well, if those rules change in a span of 50, 60 years, then don't we need to do a better job of paying attention to the why behind the rule than the rule itself? Now, here's why we don't. And I can explain it very easily, and I think you will understand. Knowing where the lines are make us comfortable. Right? I know where all of the boundaries are. We can set it down very simply and say, this is it. And if I go there, I'm out of line. So as long as I stay here, I'm where I'm supposed to be. But Paul spends way more time asking questions about why and how we interact with each other along the way. Don't expect your brothers to get circumcised because you want them to. Sorry, Galatians. That's an unfair expectation of you to place on somebody else. But Timothy, I think we should probably do it because it's going to make things a lot smoother for us as we work in this community. These are choices missionaries have been making for hundreds of years. Right? Yeah. You have to understand how to operate in different situations. As you pay attention to how Paul writes these letters, if you read the letter as a whole, what you learn very quickly is that the rule itself is always secondary to the relationship behind it. Always. How are we going to interact with, live with each other in a way that is meaningful, that forms community with all of the diversity in place that exists in all of the churches in Galatia, which is a region, not a city. That's a lot of places to work their way through. Because if there's that much diversity just in Corinth, you know they're dealing with loads in an entire province. Or with the Corinthians. For y'all, that whole meat sacrifice to idols thing, not a big deal. You'd never eat meat if you didn't eat meat sacrificed to idols in Corinth. The whole reason there's a beef industry is we're cooking steaks on the altar every day. It's fine. Don't make it a problem for somebody else. Don't chow down in front of somebody you know is going to be a problem for. By the time we get to Thyatira, the situation, that wasn't me. The situation between the empire and the church has changed. How dare you do anything that connects you with Rome in any positive way? You stay as far away from that as you possibly can. You don't even sacrifice idols. You don't participate in local customs and markets. You stay out of the guilds. The whole reason Paul is worried about, or the church in Corinth is worried about meat sacrificed to idols, is because there are people asking about our livelihoods. If I can't participate in these local guilds, which meet at these temples, and participate in these meals, then how am I going to survive? Paul says, go for it. Just don't make it a problem for other people. I think the biggest thing we've got to take away from all of this is how we interact with each other. The give and take that exists inside a church relationship. Because the pursuit of this is what it has to be hadn't gotten us very far. It's been, I'd say, rather divisive along the way with the 3,278 denominations that exist in the United States alone. I made up that number. I think it's actually low. And the lack of grace with which we've treated each other as we've argued about what is and isn't okay, it is even sadder. Especially when Paul shows us over and over and over again how important it is to act graciously with each other as we make these decisions and be sure that there's room for as many people as we can get to the table as possible. And that's what makes Paul's absolute lines stand out. 1 Corinthians has an absolute line in it. You've got a dude hooking up with his mother. No! That's a pretty stark line, right? You're wasting at communion. No. Meat sacrifice to idols? A divisive issue for Jews and Gentiles? Y'all figure out how to do that together. Which puts a lot of it back on us. We like the rules because they don't require us to think. They give us something simple to stand in. Yeah?
I think another really important part for any of these things with talking about these letters is to remember that no matter how many times we've written our own letters, we never imagined that we put them all together.
Yeah.
So when he's writing these letters to this group of people, he's not thinking it's going to be smashed right next to a letter that he wrote to these other people.
Yeah.
Because who sees that stuff?
Yeah. These are.
Somebody did. It's great.
Yeah, these are.
Thought that way at that time.
Yeah, deeply personal. Hey, you got to remember, at the time when Paul's writing, there's no Old Testament. There's no set list of books that's in and that's out. Synagogues had scrolls. They didn't have all the scrolls. They had some of them. Good synagogues had most of them. The temple had a fairly healthy collection. But there was no, Bible on the shelf at the average Jewish family's home. They couldn't have read it even if it was there. So the idea of collecting and reading anything like that for the common person was not on the table. Paul writes these letters to people with specific needs and with the understanding that that's going to help them. Is there good for us to pull from it? Yes. But historically, we've pulled from bad places as much as we've had good places. And I think it's important for us to recognize that tendency in ourselves and do a better job of reading. Does that make sense? Cool. Because it's time for me to be done. It gets even more fun. Next week, I think we're going to talk about the Old Testament. God says, kill them all. And then immediately doesn't. Did y'all ever catch that? Wipe out everybody in Canaan, and then the first thing God does is rescue Rahab. God breaks God's own rules, and it's awesome. All right.